Second, I had to show that the existence of morality pointed to a divine creator. Lastly, I had to show his value in relation to the creator and the morality of suicide. However, if you interpreted my words as a mere self-righteous lecture, then I risked the possibility of expediting Will's self-caused death. To distract Will from suicidal thoughts, I just somehow bait Will to engage in a battle of reason. I utilized the most timeless and almost fail-proof method to start the discussion. Insult him in what he prided himself the most, his intelligence. I once held your intelligence in the highest regard, but now I look directly at Will. Your lack of intelligence astounds me. Momentarily dumbfounded by the sudden change of topic, but more so by the insult, Will for once was rendered speechless for an entire minute, but soon afterwards he spoke accordingly.
Mr. Johnson, I understand you think I'm wrong. Nonetheless, was it truly necessary to demean my intelligence? Is it appropriate for you, my mentor, to insult me, a child who is still young in grief?
It is because I, as your mentor, witnessed a rash and purely emotional based decision, I am able to question your intelligence. Had it been any other 14-year-old boy, Will would have walked away in disgust. But I knew how greatly Will prided himself in his intelligence. Indignant, he stood up from his chair and asked,
What is so unintelligent in ending a meaningless life?
Without realizing it, Will took my bait and entered into my battle of reason. There are many reasons I could list. The primary reason is that the rational individual would acknowledge the existence of the absolute standard of morality and do his best to abide by it. The universality of morality is the reason that laws prohibiting murder even exist. If morality didn't exist, then each person would be free to act without fear of punishment. Everyone would only act in the way that is advantageous to them, thus creating disarray and chaos. A society ruined by anarchy which not would last. For even Aristotle said that law is order.
Mr. Johnson, I too thought the same way until today. But upon reconsideration, I noticed a flaw due to philosophers' narrow-minded search for morality. While many philosophers try to explain what morality is and how best to apply it, very few philosophers ask the fundamental question, does morality even exist? If morality is as universal as you claim, why do immoral actions occur on a daily basis? What I found is that what one man considers right could be what another man considers wrong. For example, in our society, it is considered immoral to eat the flesh of another human. However, if one were to observe cannibal tribes, to eat a person's flesh is considered normal and morally acceptable. Based on the time, place, and people, the assumed absolute standard of morality seems to be inconsistent. I therefore concluded that the morality which you speak of does not exist.
It doesn't? I questioned as I raised an eyebrow.
No.
He replied firmly.
Morality is a man-made concept out of pure necessity or convenience.
If that's the case, I stood up, made eye contact with Will, and promptly slapped him in the face. I restrained myself to just enough force for the slap to briefly sting.
Mr. Johnson!
Will exclaimed with shock.
What on earth has overcome you?
I suppressed a smile and said, if you unquestionably believe there is no such thing as morality, why do you look at me as if I committed a wrong against you? Before you could answer the question, I said, further, let's suppose what you have said is all true. You realize what you're arguing for is moral relativism.
I am fully aware.
He answered while rubbing his slightly sore cheek. Are you also aware that what you are arguing for is very similar to the axiom, truth is subjective? Or as Protagoras once put it, man is the measure of all things. For if truth was subjective, then all objective standards, including morality, would be considered null.
I am.
If that's the case, let's shift our discussion from the idea of morality and focus on the idea of truth. If such subjects such as mathematics or science exist, how could you argue that truth is subjective?
As Nietzsche once observed, perhaps nobody yet has been truthful enough to know what truthfulness is. At first glance, subjects such as science may seem objective and timeless. However, there are two arguments explaining how examples such as these are still compatible in the perspective of subjective truth. The first argument I borrow from the esteemed philosopher David Hume. He explains science isn't objective truth, but the interpretation of our mind. He said, when we are accustomed to see two impressions conjoined together, the appearance or idea of the one carries us to the idea of the other. By experiencing and observing a repeated cause and effect, our mind develops the habit of expecting a specific cause to result in a specific effect. The habitual expectation can be seen in the tick of a clock. Only by constantly observing a clock ticking does the mind expect for the clock to continually tick. Secondly, even subjects like mathematics are not objective. The idea that 1 + 1 = 2 is only true because people have assigned meaning to the numbers 1 and 2. Because people agree on a specific interpretation of numbers, not an objective truth, mathematics is possible. Similarly, the so-called objective truths or standards are nothing but the result of human interpretation.
I was so much in awe that Will, who was only 14, could come up with such arguments on such short notice of time that I almost forgot to respond. But I quickly cleared my mind and responded to his arguments. You mainly argue that all objective truth can be reduced to human interpretation of a mental habit. Tell me, are people capable of living for thousands of years? To that, he replied.
Of course not.
If that is true, then your entire argument crumbles on its own. Slightly perplexed, he asked,
How so?
a mental habit or interpretation of a person only exists so long as the person is alive and is able to observe these mental habits, correct?
Yes.
History records Sir Isaac Newton as the individual who discovered the law of gravity. But suppose that was only a mental habit developed by Newton's mind. Did the law of gravity suddenly disappear when Newton died?
No, but other people would be able to observe this law occurring.
If then a baby who has not been able to form mental habits yet dropped an apple, would or would not the law of gravity apply in this case? Not wanting to admit defeat, he said,
I'm not sure.
I pressed him even further. Allow me to make an argument of my own by destroying the very foundation of this objectivity of truth. For this axiom to apply, would it not have to be true in of itself?
I suppose so.
Even if we continue to use this self-contradicting axiom, what happens if a person disagrees with the truth, that all truth is subjective? Is he not allowed to disagree? Is he not allowed to have his own truth? What then?
Fine, you're right.
He admitted with a slightly flustered face.
It is true that there is truth.
By that logic, we'd also agree that it is plausible for an absolute standard such as morality to exist.
Yes.
He reluctantly conceded.
But even if there is such a concept as morality, that doesn't prove which specific actions, like my own, are moral or immoral. In fact, in Japanese culture, it is considered honorable to commit suicide instead of defeat. Even in our American Revolution, people died for what they deemed a worthy cause. How am I any different?
That question is answered when we consider the origin of morality. Surely you don't believe that morality simply came into existence out of nothing.
That is a possibility.
Really, do you not believe that every effect has a cause?
Yes, but what could possibly create an absolute and timeless standard like morality?
I answered with one word. God. We'll burst into laughter.
God? You mean a supposed almighty being, like Jesus Christ, who somehow created everything?
Yeah, where's the humor in that?
You honestly want me to believe in a religion that contains talking donkeys, men walking in and out of fire unscathed, or people being raised from the dead? Please, Mr. Johnson, religion is old-fashioned. We're better suited in fairy tales in our discussion on morality.
It is because I believe in that God, the only being who is capable of doing anything but doing wrong, that those stories are true. The simplest way of proving this is true using the concept of cause and effect. Do you believe that every effect has a cause?
I know this for a fact.
Good, let me ask you, who makes all the bread I eat in the morning?
The baker.
Who made all the clocks in my house?
The clocksmith. Mr. Johnson, what is the point of all these questions?
We'll get there, I promise. I listed object after object, and we became more and more irritated until he finally couldn't keep his growing frustration.
What is the point of all these questions?
He demanded.
Why do you keep asking me nearly the same thing repeatedly?
I then started to get to my point. Who created morality?
The most likely answer is someone long ago thought of it and it has developed ever since.
You genuinely believe that a person who is imperfect and full of faults by nature is capable of creating an absolute standard? I don't believe that's the case. An imperfect creator makes an imperfect creation. The bread that the baker bakes eventually grows moldy, and the clocksmith's clocks will one day stop ticking. Only an absolute and timeless being could create an absolute and timeless standard, such as morality. I paused and saw Will visibly struggle to process everything I just said. He eventually asked,
Why should I care? Knowing that God created morality doesn't bring back my dead uncle, doesn't relieve my anguish, and doesn't do anything for me.
His voice increased as he asked again,
So tell me, why should I care? What has God ever done for me or for anyone? Even Christians recognize that God created a world where imperfection is the fundamental law of the external world, that he who does not get work does get bread, and he who sleeps gets it even more abundantly than he who works. Your God, who created the universe and morality, also allows injustice, war, and even death. This God,
he then emphasized each word slowly,
has nothing to do with me.
Seeing Will to start becoming a little emotional, I tried to direct the conversation back to a logical conclusion. Well, I'm not trying to upset you, but you have to understand if morality was created by God, then you, created by God, shouldn't prematurely end your life.
How?
He asked, now a little bit calmer.
How is it wrong to want to escape a world that I no longer have any place in?
Reminding myself to stay calm and logical, I answered. A man known as St. Augustine once answered this question hundreds of years ago. There was a situation in which women were violated. One woman in particular, Lucretia, being uncleaned and ashamed, ended her life. Augustine concluded that if it is not lawful to take that law into our own hands and slay even a guilty person, whose death no public sentence is warranted, then certainly he who kills himself is a homicide, so much guiltier of his own death. If it is immoral to kill, then to commit suicide is no different. Even the pagan Phaedo understood that if, as he explained, that life is given from above, then you cannot so easily discard life as an object. Because we're created and we're given life, your life is not yours to take. At this point, Will looked like a cornered animal. He had run out of arguments against me, but still couldn't reconcile the death of his uncle. Feeling confused and trapped, he said,
I don't know, Mr. Johnson. I don't know. Even though I know you're right, I don't know what to do. Even though I know I'm wrong, I don't know what to do. Because even if everything you said till now is true, even if there is a God, I don't know what to do without my uncle.
As he said that, his eyes started to tear up. And in that moment, he didn't look like the intellectual genius that I knew him to be. He looked like a lost, helpless boy. Because stripped of all of his mature speech and intelligence, Will was just a boy, struggling to cope with the death of his uncle. I realized I tried to convince him the wrong way. I took a deep breath and put my hands on his shoulders. Will, I know whatever I say or do won't return what you feel robbed of. People only have one life. There's no restart or second chance. That's what makes life so precious. I believe by crying for your uncle, you recognize that he was inherently valuable. Because God created him and gave him worth, you cry. In the same way a painter loves and values his painting, the creator for everything loves and put immeasurable worth in you. Will, there is value in simply being alive. There's value in smiling, crying through the struggles, laughing to the joys of life, and living to the very end. My voice grew desperate and pleading. So please, Will, don't die. Live. knew what it was like to live without a family. My eyes watered until my eyes could no longer hold back the tears. I knew how empty and torn one could feel at the same time. Then, Will and I cried together. We cried for each other. We cried for Will's uncle who would never come back. And we probably cried just for the sake of crying. After what seemed like an eternity, we dried our tears and looked at each other. We both laughed at how messy our face looked and how puffy our eyes were. After vainly trying to convince Will that the tears in my eyes were simply because of the dust in the air, I looked at him and said, Will, nothing I say or do will bring back the dead to life. As hard as it is, know that your reason to live doesn't come from yourself or your uncle. It comes from a God who loves you, who made you, who died for you, and gave you value. That is why I'm asking, no, begging you to live. My tears resurfaced. He looked at me gratefully and said,
I will.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cho. I am going to pause for a moment and let some of the people outside come in because they're too shy to come in. And so give me just a minute when we get started. We do have seats in here. You guys would like to come in? You'll miss out a very good question and answer period. So good to see you guys. Yeah, there's a seat right there. If you want to bring in chairs, It has 10, so it might have to be on the
Okay.
Liam will share, unless he doesn't really need to introduce yourself. So, you got chairs. These are actually chairs right there. You can take this bottle off if you like. What do you want to? You can just put chairs back behind him back there. You also some seats on the bench over here if you like. So. Oh, and then. Wait a minute, Sarah's still. Where's Sarah Gonzalez? Oh, there she is. She's here. Okay, you gotta need a bigger presence. So, all right. Okay, Mr. Cho, you ready?
yeah, I'm ready.
Thank you very much for your paper. Very nicely read. Very thank you for Veronica's assistance there. Very good duo. Throughout your paper, there's continue to be echoes of Brothers Karamazov and the exhortation to live. And I may have missed it, but I didn't see any references to that text throughout this book and throughout your essay. And I just wonder, is that a conspicuous absence, or did you not see that there's a similar theme going on to your paper here? What's going on with that?
I saw a lot of similarities. I actually took a lot of inspiration from that book, but I didn't find a place where I agreed with the style, the way he spoke, and the exact wording that he said. And because the concept is kind of universal, I just pretended it was my own and ran it with Peter Cho on top.
Okay, all right. Just kind of plagiarize Dostoevsky and make it show. All right, yeah, a beautiful idea. And I would like to focus on the issue of whether or not the fact that we have an awareness of morality necessarily indicates a argument for the existence of God. And so, I mean, taking the example of the laws of the universe, all right, physical laws of physics. Could you explain the laws of physics without the presence of a divinity by simply saying, you know, the laws of the universe are something that we as humans have the capacity to observe, and so we observe them, and the fact that we are capable of observing those laws and, you know, making rockets that follow them is not necessarily an argument for God's existence. So also morality, you could say it is simply another law of the universe. We observe it, we are aware of it, and because of that, we can choose to live life in light of that morality. And so can morality be something that is simply a fact of the universe that we have a natural capacity to observe that doesn't necessarily point towards the necessary existence of a God?
That wasn't necessarily phrased as a question, but I'll answer that anyways. So basically, I believe that science, I brought the idea of science and mathematics, can explain and be manipulated so we can do a lot of things. We can make a rocket go to the space, and we can make simple devices that make everyday life really easy. It explains how things are done really well. It doesn't explain why things are done that specific way, which is why in my actual paper, I phrased it in the way of the origin of morality. I think even our ability to observe certain things means that somebody gave us that ability so that things like those are observable.
Mm-hmm. Well, okay, going back to the scientific analogy, is the fact that we can observe the law of gravitation make it necessary for us to explain its origin? Or can we simply say, it is something that I observe? I observe that the law of gravitation applies to the world we live in. And so similarly, I might say, I observe the laws of morality in the universe, but I don't necessarily have to explain where they come from. I can simply be, without an answer on that question.
Sure, anybody can ignore the truth, but doesn't make the truth suddenly irrelevant or not exist anymore. You can tell and look and observe at different laws of science or math and pretend like those don't make perfect sense, even though people aren't perfect. But that doesn't suddenly make the truth and the origin of it suddenly disappear. Anybody can ignore truth, but the truth still exists.
Yes, but why is the origin the only truth that needs to be observed? And cannot it also be a truth that, yes, it does exist? And so I acknowledge the truth of morality, the reality of morality, and the very present character it has to me. I can say, yes, I am aware of justice and the moral code as much as I am aware of the hand in front of my face. It's obvious. And to say I acknowledge that truth. And yet to say that you can just disconnect that link from saying that now I need to go on and explain an origin for that. And be able to have an account for that. You're saying I'm ignoring that truth. Couldn't somebody just acknowledge the reality of morality without having to go on further to explain an origin for that?
Yeah, you don't have to make the argument of a cause for every effect. But I did, and which is why in this paper, not everybody makes those arguments, but in this specific paper, I brought up the argument, and then people are feeling free to respond to it. But anyways, I feel like what you're stating is kind of the equivalent of looking at every effect and ignoring the fact that there is a cause. Like you said, you can acknowledge that there's effects that exist. But then what I'm saying is that we know that every effect has a cause. And for you to just look and acknowledge the effect without really acknowledging the cause is only half of the picture.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's certainly a very natural tendency. Immanuel Kant calls it transcendental illusion. And so to bring in Kant here, Kant seems to make a disconnect between having to kind of make that backward train of causation, and Kant basically argues that causation only applies to the world that we see, the world around us, and that trying to apply the world of causation to the world that I cannot see is invalid. I cannot observe the world I cannot see, so I don't even know if the laws of causation apply. What would you say to Kant or somebody who made that similar case that outside of my experience, I don't know the laws of causation? And so I see things around me, but what caused them, I don't observe that. And so I'm not going to speculate about the chains of causation that would exist there.
Firstly, he doesn't really give you a reason not to believe that everything you've seen up to that point will hold true if you extrapolate it, right?
Mm.
Secondly, I think that everything, I already gave the example, everything that is observable to one person, that is also observable to every single other person, is probably something that's universal and absolute.
Mm.
I gave the example of Sir Isaac Newton, and even though he died, we still have the law of gravity, otherwise we wouldn't be here in the first place.
Mm-hmm. All right, thank you very much. Others have questions?
Oh.
Lovely paper, I really enjoyed it. My question is, if you apply the law of cause and effect to everything, what is preventing you from extrapolating it even further and saying, just in the way that you say, who made the clock, you say the clocksmith, and who made the clocksmith, you say God. Why don't you say who made God? Why does it stop there?
That's a great question. A lot of people have asked that same question. And I feel like at every single storytelling or interpretation of the start of the universe, everybody has something that they make their god. If you look at evolution, time and chance becomes their god. If we have enough time, you put enough chances and possibilities, anything is possible. I think it's a lot more plausible to say something who actually had intelligence could make intelligent beings and everything that is complex with our universe. Because everything has to have some kind of origin. It makes a lot more sense of something of random chance versus something that actually had an intended form and use of everything.
Thank you.
So you mentioned Hume, and I guess kind of positioning that against the absolute standard through perception and observing things. What sort of role do you think that emotion and perception play in coming to grasp the world of truth and God? Because very often you'll hear people say, I felt God's presence, or I had a God experience. How much does that I guess directly oppose the logic and the intelligence that you're putting that against?
Well, I'm sure you listened to the entire thing. I actually gave a logical approach until like the very last 3 paragraphs. And after that, it's like all emotion, right? I believe that they both can coexist, and when we interpret and actually use our emotions without being the person who's like overly emotional, I believe that the feeling and experience of like love in its truest form or loss in the truest form, at that point, you ultimately have this feeling that I feel like leads people to believe that that feeling known as love, justice, or morality wasn't caused by something that came from people, because you feel that feeling of euphoria or that feeling of like pleasure or love, again, all these kind of different emotions. And when you really feel it and experience like that highest peak within your mind and mental state, I think a lot of people won't deny the fact that something as grand as that, I can't speak words into that because it's really hard to describe emotions a lot of the times because of how complex it is to each and every different person. The emotions do lead to someone who created those emotions in us, right? I may have dodged that question, but
Could you explain further what exactly you mean by saying that God creates morality?
I'm not so sure if there are any other way to say that God created morality. Is there something else you wanted me to say, or?
I mean, let's see. Are you saying that God creates morality in the same way that, say, he creates humanity? That he basically takes nothing and then brings morality out of that as an act of creation, as opposed to it being like an eternal thing that would be more defined by his character?
Yes, so obviously morality isn't recorded in the Bible as being something created necessarily, like we didn't take up the dust and say morality. I think that this is something closer to do with being created in the image of God. If we look at the Bible, we have every single trait and characteristics of God, and because we're made in the image of that, that thing is continuing in every single human.
So you would say that morality is the human manner of expressing our being made in the image of God?
Yes and no. I could go into the entire theological side by talking about how law was actually a form of expressing to people that you're messed up and you can't measure to that standard. But I believe that the origin of it wasn't something that was created like all the 6 days of creation, but something that came almost indirectly through the image of God.
Alright, thank you.
Lovely paper, by the way. I had a question regarding, you mentioned about halfway through the paper that, in Japanese culture it's considered honorable to commit suicide instead of defeat, and in our American Revolution people have died for what they deem a worthy cause, which Mr. Johnson answers that, that kind of relativism there is answered by looking at the origin of morality. I had a question, because is it really answered by that question? Does the existence of an absolute morality mean that we are able to perceive it in its absolute form and understand it to be true without any other possible mistakes that we might make?
That was a heavily worded question. Could you rephrase it and dumb it down for me?
Sorry. So you say that morality exists and is absolute because it is given by an absolute lawgiver. So at the same time, we are imperfect beings
Yeah.
and are probably imperfectly able to perceive the truth. So even though morality is absolute, are we really able to give an answer as to whether, say, it is honorable to commit suicide instead of being defeated, or to die for what is deemed a worthy cause? Are those things that can be answered by imperfect beings such as us?
I think that because we're all created by God, we have something in us that is, as I said, an image of God, part of us that have almost like this godness. I will sound sacrilegious when I say that, but basically carry around an expression of God in themselves. And even though that's corrupted, we always have this some sort of lens that we can see some extent of truth. And I think it's better to pursue the truth, even though we're imperfect and may not be able to see the absolute form of truth, than to say we can't find it, so we give up entirely.
So I was really interested at the beginning of your paper how you labeled Achilles' choice to die with great glory as suicide. And I was just wondering, I guess, what about his death did you perceive as more suicidal than just, I guess, what other people would label it? Because oftentimes, obviously, when you go into war, like, you're putting your life on the line. There's plenty of examples of people, like, pushing their comrades out of the way to die for them and stuff like that. So I guess, what about Achilles' choice made you label it as suicide versus other deaths that you see in war, whether for the sake of the cause, like you mentioned later in the paper, and what Anna was kind of talking about, or mentioned at the beginning of her question, or risking your life for like a greater cause, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Because I'm not arguing with it. I just think it was really interesting.
I think for Achilles specifically, he wasn't your typical hero per se. He was really arrogant and bigoted. If we look into Achilles, he wasn't the normal person who goes into war and actually sacrifices himself for the cause. He was sacrificing himself for himself. And because of that, I feel like it is a form of suicide because he was causing that form of death onto himself, not for a higher purpose, but for the purpose of somehow having eternal glory. Yeah.
Okay, it's been a long time since I've read about Achilles, but he was told that he would die young. Right? If he followed the path that he was following glory. Right?
Yeah.
So, and you label that as a suicide. Okay, so my question would be, how would you label Christ's sacrifice?
Yeah, so if we actually look back to the Achilles part, in the Iliad, forgive me if I'm wrong, it's been a long time. If we actually look to GBT1 and that book, the Iliad, I think there's a point where his mom, the goddess, basically tells him that he's going to have a choice. He can either live a short life, but have a victorious battle, right? Or he can just stop that kind of lifestyle and then live a little bit longer, right? So in that instance, I think that he had that choice to commit suicide or not, because it was like that self-choice, even though it was prophesied, he has a choice inside the entire kind of storyline. For the action of Christ, again, I think it comes with the idea of a higher purpose. It's almost weird to say higher purpose when we're comparing Christ, but I feel like because he did it not for himself, remember, he came as a servant, he came to serve and not to be served, and he came literally to die. And it wasn't something that he did for himself or for the people he sacrificed and loved, that it's something known as like a self-sacrificial love versus our glories, I'm going to die early.
So this is just me kind of making sure I understand you. So I guess what I'm gauging from your two answers is that you label suicide as an act of death caused by the self for purely selfish reasons versus for a higher purpose like saving others or anything, which is what would differentiate Achilles from Christ.
Yeah.
Okay.
I would like to have you explain why you don't rule out morality as being simply a human creation. We talk of stories. I can invent a story. I make a story. You might say the laws of physics. I don't really make the law of gravity.
Yeah.
There we talk more of acknowledging it. You seem to be arguing that there's not a possibility that humans have simply created morality. How would you argue against that possibility, that humans tell stories and morality is similar to a story that is told?
First of all, I gave this simple sentence I like, that imperfect people can't make perfect creations. They make imperfect creations, right? The second thing is, that analogy of the story kind of falls apart. I want you to think of that one person telling that story, but somehow without really telling that story to anybody else across the other side of the world. You find an almost identical story everywhere around the world, because morality is universal, right? If you were to compare a story and morality, that would be everybody having that same story, even though it wasn't told to the other person. So because it's a story given by somebody else, and it makes a lot more sense that not somebody inventing it and then spreading it around inventing it.
Well, and we do seem to have different moral codes. Suicide, and ancient Romans and the medieval Christians had very different concepts of the morality of suicide. If you look at marital practice, I mean, in one culture you have your spouse arranged for you by your family, you meet them on your wedding day, and other culture says that's abominable. Right? You just can't do it that way. And so you seem to have kind of contradictory moral tales that are told. And so you argue for a universal moral code, but couldn't it also be that morality is similar to stories that are told that are different between different cultures?
Well, we're right there, Norm. I'm kidding. If we actually look at a lot of these things, I'd say first those are usually exceptions to the rule. A lot of arranged marriages are actually not happening regularly as to this day. Hopefully I'm not going to be having an arranged marriage. But the other thing to look at is that in those finer details of morality, that's when I feel like our corrupted self, sin corrupting our whole image of God, tends to take a role. For really obvious things, such as not to kill a person, I think it's obvious to everybody. But when you get into those really gray areas, that's when our incompetence, imperfection start to play a role, and we can't make those finer details out. Whether they're right or wrong, I'm not going to say, but I feel like the obvious standards are the ones that are most obviously pointing to a greater.
All right, thank you very much. Other questions?
Sorry, this is kind of playing off of Mr. H's question, but could you not say that because there are gray areas in morality, and even things that come down to the difference of two different morals, whether you lie to a person to save others or whether you tell the truth and risk other people's lives, do you think that could be due to humans making morality and only agreeing on the bigger things, like don't kill people because it's not good for society? No one wants a loved one to die, and we can all kind of agree on the same emotional appeals. So I guess just what would be your thoughts around that?
Can you phrase the question like in one sentence?
Yeah, sorry. That was kind of rambly. Being that there are so many gray areas in morality, do you think that humans could have made morality and disagreed on the smaller things, but agreed on the bigger things, making it appear like some sort of universal morality?
That is a reasonable possibility, but my question would be, why would it be that case? Why choose yours over mine? I'll actually be explaining why we should have my worldview. Because those different subtleties and those different gray areas from person to person, I think it actually goes all the way from imagining a person in himself. An individual is, in of himself, probably going to be very different from people. Isolate him from society and he's going to look very, very different from people. But even if you isolated him, I think he would still have this moral code within himself, not to kill, not to intentionally take life from another. Even, who was it? Rousseau has this, and he gives this idea of a noble savage, and even they have this kind of rough idea of what to do and what not to do. In terms of those differences, within the gray areas of society, you're probably going to have to look at the idea of how close those stories actually are interlinked within each other. If what your story is true and everybody basically had the same story, and kind of tweaked it to their own kind of idea or whatever they wanted to take in or take out, then if we looked at the very beginning of time, then there wouldn't be certain laws like not to kill the other person because it hasn't had enough time for it to spread and for each person to interpret the story to their own liking. Because if we actually look at it, the earth, in my opinion, is kind of young, and if we even look at history, people seem to have very similar laws, even though they never met the other person or experienced the same in different cultures.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Cho.